Hello, I'm John Kao, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to another episode of Intersections. You'll notice, those of you who are observant in the audience, that there's one person today instead of two. My partner, Brian Solis, who I think you know actually has a day job, which is Global Innovation Evangelist for Salesforce, was called away at the very last minute. And since we view Intersections as kind of like a jazz club for ideas, the essence of improvisation is saying yes and. So for me, it's saying yes and. So I'm going to fly solo. Solo piano can sound pretty good. Obviously, so piano and bass or piano and guitar or another instrument is interesting as well. But I think we're going to be in great shape because we have two phenomenal guests who I'll introduce shortly, who are leaders in their fields of digital technology, artificial intelligence, entertainment, popular culture, and much, much more. So welcome to Intersections. Let's be a little formal for a moment. We are a weekly conversational jam session, 10:30 to 11:30 Pacific on your not radio dial. And where our intention is to dive deeply into where culture and technology and new ideas come together in the form of pioneers, pathfinders, entrepreneurs, people who are leading the edge of what is relevant today. I wrote a piece a while back in Forbes, which got a fair amount of notice, which was about the difference between disruption and discontinuity. You know, everybody's talking about disruption. We got so disrupted by the pandemic and so forth and so on. And I think that leads to a certain thought pattern which says disruption has to be mitigated. Let's get back to an undisrupted time. I prefer the whole notion of discontinuity because we're like sailors who have somehow wound up in the middle of the ocean with maps that no longer apply to the rest of our journey. And so we have to create new maps in order to get to that far shore of opportunity. And I think that what the theme is of many, if not all of our guests, is really that they're expert map makers. They know how to navigate in a situation where the old maps really don't apply anymore, and they have invented new pathways to get to their desired outcome. So we bring those diverse personalities and perspectives and worldviews together in service of not only a greater understanding, but a greater unlearning, because it's a time really to be thinking about how to go beyond our established beliefs and our mental models to something fresh and new. So let me briefly introduce Brian, who's not here. Actually, this is great. I can say whatever I want about him behind his back. But, you know, Brian is a very distinguished thought leader in the digital domain who has been working tirelessly to link digital technology as an agenda to social media and social marketing and to innovation, multiple storied publications of best-selling books, keynote speeches, and an immense public profile in this whole emerging wave of new technology and new business models and just new ways of looking at things. So he and I are highly complementary because our mutual obsession is really understanding where innovation is going as a field. You know, I would argue that innovation, which I've been identified with for some 30 years, is not yet even a discipline because there's so many different ways that people have of describing it, and they're bringing their kind of favorite framework and mental model and, guru du jour to the table. So in a sense, my own story is I've been involved with the fields of business creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship, leadership, that whole kind of smush of concepts for a long time. I taught at Harvard Business School for 14 years. I've been out in California for the last 20 or so as a free agent, starting companies in high tech, advising interesting people like the kind of people we get on Intersections about that navigation process of reaching the future. The Economist called me Mr. Creativity. And just, you know, as context for the conversation, especially with Jonathan Taplin, I have a background in film and music, actually for Byron as well, Byron Reese, our first guest. I have a bit of a background in the whole sort of AI upending of traditional business models. So we welcome your input. please tell us where you're from. We're going to post where you're from in the chat, and please give us your questions and your comments. Please feel free to follow Brian Solis and me on social media. You can find me on Forbes.com, on all of the obvious social channels, and I welcome you to read my occasional musings on what's going on in the world. And with that, I think it's more than enough words to serve as a preface. Let's bring our first guest on deck. So, gregarious, let's bring Byron Reese. Byron, welcome to Intersections. Hey.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here. Ever since I learned that you were, we had a brief chat earlier about, and we have so many things we could talk about. Byron is based in Austin. He's got a long history of achievement in entrepreneurial matters with specific reference to digital technology. He's got a company called JJ Kent that is using a proprietary approach to AI to create delightful consumer products. He is on the board of directors of GigaOM, which is a well-known tech analyst and knowledge creating organization. He calls himself, among other things, a futurist. And I think the most timely comment I can make about Byron is that 4 days from now, he's got a new book coming out with a very intriguing title, which is Wasted. Not in the party sense of wasted, but wasted, how we squander time, money, and natural resources and what we can do about it. So we wish we had 2 hours. Welcome, Byron. Let's get started.
Thanks a bunch.
So I guess we should probably start with what is most current, which is your book. What prompted you to write it? What is it really about? What is waste? What can we do about it? Does this relate to some of the, sort of Japanese, like Toyota models of, Six Sigma, mudra and waste? Or, are we talking about something radically different? Enlighten us.
Well, why did I write it? Scott Hoffman, my co-author, and I were just talking about waste in general at lunch one day, and talked about how it's ill-defined in that it's a noun, it's a verb, it's an adjective. It can mean an absence of something or an excess of something. It's kind of this nebulous word that's in our lives so much. And so what we decided to do was write a science book about waste. And so what it is it's a book about, it's a book about systems and how the systems of the modern world produce a lot of waste. It's not a policy book. It doesn't, and it isn't a book that tells people how they should live their lives. It isn't, it doesn't try to shame anybody into anything. It's really a book about just understanding why waste happens and how, even despite our best intentions, it does.
What would be some examples of these systems that throw off waste that were noteworthy in your research?
Oh, I mean, you could pick how what are known as reverse logistics, how when you buy something and then you return it, how that goes back. Clothes you no longer wear, so there are this whole engine that produces clothing for you, and then this back end that may or may not process it efficiently. There's carbon dioxide, how the world modern systems produce an enormous amount of it, and the incentives to eliminate that aren't really in place. Water, which is a big, complicated, big thing. Rain's coming down, and water treatment plants, and aquifers, and all of that, and you just end up with all these unintended consequences. And really, more interestingly, all kinds of things you would never expect to be the case. Like in writing this book, it was about the most humbling thing I've ever done, because I went into it assuming that I knew a little bit about all these topics, and it turns out I was really ignorant. I was woefully ignorant. So much of what I thought I knew wasn't true. And there's a humility, on the one hand, there's a humility in that, but on the other hand, there's a real sense of learning. I'll tell you an example, if I could.
Sure, please.
So 2 Boston University professors wrote a paper called "The Effect of Recycling versus Trashing on Consumption," and what they did was an experiment where they were at a university, and they put out 4 different pitchers of different juices. And what they told the students is, we want you to come in and taste each of these juices and rank them from best to worst. Seems straightforward. And so they had a big stack of disposable cups next to the pitchers, and they had a trash can. And as you can imagine, some of the students would come in and get 1 cup and refill it 4 times, and others would use 4 different cups. And then they would throw them away. And then you could count the number of cups in the trash and get an average of about 2.2 cups per person. Then what they did is they got rid of the trash can and they put a recycle bin there. And when they put the recycle bin there, the number of cups people used went up to 2.6 cups. The theory being that when people see the recycling bin, they're like, oh, it's going to be recycled. I might as well just use a clean cup each time. And then they were able to reproduce that with, here, tear off some wrapping paper or wrap this book. Same thing happened with the blue bin. The amount of wrapping paper they tore off went up. So it was a lot of things like that, where it's not saying recycling's bad or anything like that, but it's saying that it changes us. If we think this thing's going to be recycled, we up our consumption of it, because it's almost like it's guilt-free consumption. And really the only way you can make that work is to consume less. That it's very hard to mitigate all that stuff at the on the recycling, and it's better if you just never made it to begin with. So that would be the kind of thing. Also, I learned a lot about something called virtual water, how water gets exported all around the world in crops. So you could imagine growing a water-intensive crop, say in the middle of the desert somewhere, and then shipping it someplace else, and you're really effectively moving water out of that area. So there were just many things like that that I just didn't know anything about, and then I learned a bit about. And I'll just say one more thing. The thesis of the book is that if you understand, like, look, we can all go crazy trying to figure out, well, plastic versus paper, which do I pick? And there's 10,000 things like that. Do I use a paper towel or a dish rag to wipe up the spill? Like, there's just an innumerable number of those, and they're hard to keep track of. And so the thesis of the book was that if people understand the system, the larger system, that those sorts of point decisions become much easier.
Are you optimistic that people will be able to change their behavior en masse to reduce waste, or what do you think the leverage points will be for shifting the waste equation, so to speak? I mean, I don't think anybody would deny that there's an enormous amount of waste going on, and it seems like one of the very important purposes of the book is to inspire us to really think about waste in a very creative and different kind of way, and not to bring our tired old assumptions to bear. But then the question is, once you see the need for a new perspective, how does that translate into action? And you said it's neither a policy book nor a kind of a prescription book for citizens. So what did you learn about how we're going to solve this issue? Because it's or this portfolio of issues, because it's obviously really important.
Well, I guess I would say a few things to that. First, I think Scott and I both believe that knowledge is power, and just empowering people to understand what's kind of going on in all of these systems. Just if you knew, you would probably make different kinds of choices. Like, if you add up all the money spent on clothing in a year and divide it by the number of people on the earth, you get that the average person spends about $300 a year on clothing. But in the West,
this is for the 8 billion or so people on the planet.
Well, that's what I'm about to say. Yes, but in the West,
wow,
in the U.S. and in Europe, we spend $300 a year on clothing that we never wear. That we never wear, and you have this illusion that if you throw it out, that somehow somebody else is going to, like, hey, they're going to appreciate getting this thing still with tags on it or what have you, and then you kind of learn, well, odds are nobody's ever going to wear that, and it's going to either go into a landfill or be shredded and burned or used as a shop rag or something. And then maybe it changes. You think, well, maybe I don't need that piece of clothing I'm never going to wear. And then I guess the second thing that I hope comes out of it is there are a lot of the kinds of waste that happens in the world is simply because of technology, because we don't really know how to do things any better than we're doing them, or dramatically better. And I'm hoping that finding kind of those pivot points, those parts where there's a lot of leverage, that maybe more thinking can go into them. But when we went into the book, I had a naive assumption, and it was that waste has no advocates, that there's nobody who's like, I am pro waste. And I was quickly educated on that there are a lot of people, frankly, who are pro waste because it profits them personally to be. And that's insidious, because you assume none of us want waste. And so I think, though, the vast majority of us aren't pro waste, and that if shown where it's really happening, maybe we're more mindful of it. I mean, the people who've read the book already tell me now they walk around the house thinking, "Oh, I can't believe I'm throwing this lettuce out. Like, all the steps that went to come to me," and that isn't. I guess we wanted to make people more mindful of it, but it isn't supposed to be crippling. It's supposed to be empowering.
Yeah, no, I understand completely, and it sounds like the material that you present can potentially inspire a lot of entrepreneurs to figure out where the new leverage points are, and maybe create some new business models that will not only address the problem of waste but actually create value. I mean, who can say?
Yeah, I hope so. And the thing about it is that a lot of it really isn't about shaming consumers, because I don't know many consumers who've made a plastic bottle or an aluminum can or made a glass bottle or made a styrofoam container. But what I'm keenly aware is that a lot of the economic incentives are kind of the wrong way. If for instance, there was a device that cost $1 that you could put on the tailpipe of your car and it wouldn't emit any CO2 ever, you have no economic incentive to spend that dollar, right?
Right.
Because you're not paying for the CO2. And so you've got all kinds of situations like that where the people who inflict the damage are not the people who pay for it. And those are things that can be corrected through policy, you hope. But again, the book isn't trying to outline that as much as it is trying to just raise consciousness about all the different ways that waste happens.
So, in the time we have left, I'm also curious about your current venture, which has to do with AI tools for products that delight customers. And I note that you said something about the company is in stealth mode. So you obviously share as much or as little as you wish. But it obviously, part of what is intriguing about your story is that you are at the intersection of a number of different topics. And, one could even argue that data science and the topic of waste and sustainability are quite related. So what's up in terms of your thinking about AI and how it affects the the customer experience and the state of things?
I am obviously an AI enthusiast. My last book was called The Fourth Age. It was about artificial intelligence. I used to host a couple of podcasts on the topic, and it's very near and dear to my heart. And what I kind of got enough of was talking about it, and I really wanted to start a new company that actually used artificial intelligence. And so I started this company, JJ Kent, which it sees this big disconnect between all the things in the world in theory that people want and all the things that the world produces for people, and that those two things aren't necessarily in alignment, and that leads to a lot of waste. And so what JJ Kent is trying to do is apply artificial intelligence to the production of consumer goods, to say, can we make fewer things that people want more of and enjoy more, and so forth. So it's trying to connect those two. I mean, that's impossibly ambitious, because, but at least directionally trying to use data to make better decisions on the kinds of products that get made.
Sounds like the kind of company that Amazon would love to buy and then put on a shelf.
I don't know.
Well, there's so many people that want to stimulate demand, right? So the more you buy, the better. And it sounds like you're about curation in a way, or focusing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
And what about, so there's the word delight. I mean, I understand the principle of, do more with less, or be simpler in a elegant way. But what about delight? Does delight get impacted by your AI expertise?
Well, I hope maybe it's not the best word. I hope that
Oh, okay. Mhm.
if well, no, I mean, I
Yeah.
hope I wrote it. I guess I should stand by it. I guess the hope is that if we do our job right, then every single thing that you get, you will just love. It will be just the best
Mhm.
X that you've ever had, and that's really what I hope for. Because maybe all of us have, these couple of things that we have that just like every time you look at them, you're like, I just really love this. Um, and I mean, often they're mundane, right? I'm looking around for one right now, and so I want to kind of replicate that feeling as much as possible. I want more things in my life that make me smile, and and sometimes when you just see something that's just perfect, it delights you. And so that's where I came up with that word, or that's why I used that word.
Well, I think that's important because, the assumption is that growth is good, and therefore consumption is good, and therefore having more stuff is good, having more consumer choice is good, having more experts tell you that you need this, that, or the other thing, when in fact, figuring out your own internal compass about what, as you say, satisfies you perfectly without necessarily being a symptom of runaway consumption is maybe a way of describing a better life. I mean, a house full of stuff isn't necessarily an elegant house.
Right. No, that's true. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like the book is an environmental book because it's probably only half the chapters. The other half of the chapters are things about how we waste time, how we waste money,
Mm.
and my one of my favorite chapters is on planned obsolescence, about this idea that somehow the economy makes goods that it knows it are going to break, and does so deliberately, and it really tests whether that is in fact true, and how pervasive it is, and so absolutely.
So there's the word futurist in your catch line, and I wonder, if you were to meet the central casting CEO or senior government official, and they said, "Byron, you're a futurist. What are the two or three most important uh, disruptive or discontinuities that you see? What are the most important issues that you see coming down the pike?" What would you say?
I I'm of the group of people who look across the span of human history, 10,000 years, say 5,000 years of written history, and think that humanity's on this pathway and this story of things getting better. And they're better because of technology, largely because technology multiplies what people are able to do. You can do more with it than you can without it. And because of that, the history of the human race is one of scarcity. There's just never been enough stuff for everybody. But we learned this trick, which is how one person can do actually more and more and more, and that's technology. And with that trick, we have made these great strides. I mean, there's still obviously untold amounts of misery in the world, but almost by any measure, by almost any place in the world, things are better today than they were at any time in the past, whether it's infant mortality, access to education, self-government, literacy, status of women, individual liberty, self-rule. And it's all because we invented this notion of technology that we use to end or move towards ending scarcity. So I think that's the big arc of the human story, and so it's easy to get discouraged by that, to somehow say, well, yeah, it's true for 5,000 years, everything has been pretty much up and to the right. However, starting a year and a half ago, it just changed. And, and maybe if you keep it all in perspective, maybe it's easier to see long term how the trends we are on really are going to create the kind of world we used to imagine. I'll just say one last thing about that, which is if you look at the oldest utopian writing that we have, it tells stories about places with democratically elected rulers, without monarchy, with religious freedom, where there's universal education, where men and women are legally equal before the law, and And you know what? We did those in in a lot of the places of the world. We've done those, and now we have this whole other things that we now imagine are in our utopia. Um, Gene Roddenberry said there'll be no hunger and there'll be no greed, and all the children will know how to read. And I, I think that's kind of the path we're on, and so I get excited about it.
When did he say that? That's an interesting quote.
He told it to Jonathan Frakes in the 80s.
So
and
post Star Trek 1.
Correct.
Uh-huh.
He may have said it before that, but Jonathan Frakes is the one who repeated it. I wrote an entire book because of that quote. I was like, is that really true that in the 23rd century, blah, blah, blah? Or does it just rhyme? And therefore it sounds true because it rhymes. And so I wrote a whole book called Infinite Progress to say, is it really possible that there'll be no hunger and there'll be no greed and all the children will know how to read?
Well, a couple hundred years gives a pretty big cushion of time, so, you can afford to be a bit optimistic based on the luxury of time.
That is true.
Yeah. So last question here, Austin or San Francisco? You've got some perspective on both, and you live in Austin. There's a lot of discussion about the exodus from the Bay Area to the new Florence of technology, which I guess is somewhere around Austin. What's your thinking about that?
I was born here, so it's hard for me to view it objectively. And I lived in the Bay and for years, so I don't have an answer to that.
So it's to each their own, I guess. I mean, I live. I'm speaking right from South of Market Street area, literally a block and a half from South Park. People who know the Bay and the technology will recognize the neighborhood right away. Wired magazine was started a block from here, and until the pandemic, I was used to seeing thousands of digital nomads with their backpacks and their earpods going from one sort of tech center to the other, and now it's like Thanos snapped his fingers not once but twice, and we got kind of thinned out. But I think that's a general phenomenon. I think the feeling here is that with real estate at the level it is at the Bay Area, how could people not want to locate here and bring their startups here and so forth and so on? And within a couple of blocks are 20 venture capital funds that decided they had to it was like, is Sand Hill Road the headquarters with the San Francisco satellite, or is San Francisco becoming the headquarters with a Sand Hill Road satellite? Because frankly, people want to be in the city where it's cool. But anyway, Austin is very cool as well, and so is the work you've been doing. Thanks so much for being here. This has been a great review of Wasted and some of your other passions. So good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care. Be of good cheer. So, thank you, Gregarious. So I'm going to actually then introduce our second guest, and then, Greg, maybe you can bring him on. I'm actually a big fan of Jonathan Taplin's. I've known about him really since my own much tinier journey in rock and roll and film began. Jonathan is a legendary figure in a number of different areas, which again come together. So there's this kind of intersectionality, if I can use that word. As a music producer, I'll just mention a couple of things. This guy named George Harrison asked him to work on the concert for Bangladesh, and he's been involved in producing concerts for Bob Dylan and the band. And then on the film side, there was this guy named Martin Scorsese who was just about to do a film called Mean Streets back in the very early days of his career, and Jonathan was involved in producing that. So there's been a real, get your fingers dirty, engaged history of making stuff happen in the mainstream entertainment business at a very high level. Then there's also this kind of thoughtful side that I have gleaned. I mean, he's the director emeritus of USC's Annenberg Innovation Lab, Annenberg Media Center. So, obviously someone who likes to think about stuff as well, and wrote a book on the new tech culture, Move Fast and Break Things, how Facebook and Google and Amazon cornered culture and undermined democracy, which came out just 3 years ago. I'm really curious to see what that transition from, concert and film producer to, cultural critic in a sense, was all about. And he has a new book that I guess has just come out, or we'll get the details of it, which is called The Magic Years, Scenes from a Rock and Roll Life. So again, we've got a super abundance of things to talk about. And with that, Jonathan, it's really great to meet you after having heard about you all these years.
Great to be here, John.
So I guess we could start with the book in the sense that, Erik Erikson said that in the eighth developmental stage, when you were kind of in your late 60s, early 70s, which I think you and I are kind of contemporaries in that respect, there was a reckoning, in a sense, of wanting to get perspective on your life and wanting to kind of think about what was significant about it, and evaluating it in terms of, was it a life well lived, and curating it to make sure that whatever you wanted to manifest or make people aware of would actually come to the surface. And I'm curious about your book and about the thought process that went into it, because it doesn't seem, from what I've seen in terms of the reviews and what's on the internet, like it was just a tell-all book about, I went on tour with so-and-so and, we had a great time. It seems like a much more of a statement in a way. So tell us about the book and tell us about how it reflects your own journey. Because, it's obviously been a long, strange trip for you.
Yeah. I mean, the book is a look back over a period that I was lucky enough to be involved in, which is really the early 60s into the mid 70s in terms of the rock and roll business. And in that point, the politics and the culture were kind of united in a very unique way. So Bob Dylan would go down to Greenwood, Mississippi, and sing for a voter rights drive. He would go to the March on Washington and sing there. And so this sense that the culture was leading politics seemed to me really important. And in some sense, looking back over all that time and then comparing it to what's going on right now, I felt that maybe that wasn't as present. That potentially when I looked last summer at the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and even into the fall with the drive to get people to register to vote, I saw more kind of high profile prominence from LeBron James and the basketball players than I did from Jay-Z and the musicians. And I kind of wondered why that had happened, why music no longer was in the vanguard of the culture, and very brave, strong basketball players were. And so that's kind of a frame for it. I mean, look, the book is really a lot of stories that, I was lucky enough to work for Bob Dylan and George Harrison and help produce Marty Scorsese's films and be with the band at their critically important time of their life. And I saw people like Janis Joplin and Eric Clapton dealing with addictions and problems like that, and tried to learn some lessons from that. And ultimately, later in my life, I ended up doing a lot of very different things, such as helping the Bass Brothers save Walt Disney from a corporate raid, and later on founded the first video on demand, streaming service, which was called Entertainer.
In 1999, or in the late 1990s, which was way ahead of its time, as I recall.
Actually, we started in 1996, so it was way, way ahead of YouTube.
Yeah, right. Well, it's exciting to be on the leading edge for sure.
Well, yeah, sometimes you end up with arrows in your back, as we did with Entertainment. I mean, the service ended up, we had licensed movies from all of the major studios, and we're doing very well. And then they decided that they didn't want us to do that. They wanted to do it themselves, and they created their own service called Movie Link. And all of a sudden, we went from having 7,000 movies on the service to having like 7. And so I had to sue them all in federal antitrust court. And needless to say, I couldn't go back to being a movie producer when I was suing every major studio.
That was it, right?
So I transitioned into academia because they didn't seem to care, and eventually won the antitrust suit against them all. And so then I could afford to be a professor. And I stayed at USC for about 14 years and invented the innovation lab. And ironically, by the end, the innovation lab was funded by the very people that I had been suing years before.
Poetic justice.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's stick with the question of music for a second, because, I had my own kind of view on the 60s. I actually got to tour with Frank Zappa and the original Mothers of Invention when I was 18. For reasons that I still don't understand to this day. Frank auditioned me when he was on tour and came to my university, and he said, well, you seem to play pretty good. You can come out to LA and do what we do, no promises. And I hung out with them for a summer, and then, my draft number was 27 and I went back to college. But, musicians in those days had a legendary stature, and they were like prophets. When Frank talked about the values behind his very first album, it was about, you could put that on the wall of any entrepreneurial activity and have it essentially fit perfectly. And I'm curious to know what you think about the shift in music's place in our culture and in our society. You said one thing, which is, they're backseating to basketball players for Black Lives Matter. But I think there's something even bigger going on, in the sense that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, first off, there's a passage in the book where I talk about, I did a movie with the German director Wim Wenders, and we were in Berlin in 1989 making the movie before the wall came down. And the movie was set in the future, and the idea was that the wall would come down in 2000. And then, of course, we had to rewrite the script because in the middle of working on preparation, the wall came down.
Yeah.
And I made the argument that the wall came down because of rock and roll. And one of the reasons I pointed to that was that Václav Havel's very first guest at the White House, that is the Czechoslovakian version of the White House, was Frank Zappa.
Right.
And he did that because Frank Zappa was the inspiration for the Plastic People, which was a band in Czechoslovakia that almost single-handedly got the young people to sign onto the petitions that Havel had put for Charter 99 to reform the democracy in Czechoslovakia. So he understood the soft power of culture. And Zappa was the perfect example of that. To my mind, what happened was in the late 60s, a lot of people were very involved in both culture and politics. But the tragedy of the spring of 1968 was that the two leaders of that movement, that is Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, were both killed within 2 months of each other. They were both assassinated. And for a lot of people, myself included, and I was still at Princeton at this time, it was, politics will only break your heart. Why get involved in this when your leaders will be killed? And obviously John Kennedy had gotten killed 5 years earlier. And so a lot of people kind of abandoned politics for more a kind of cultural leftism, as it were. And obviously the Woodstock Festival in late 69 was an example of that, in the sense that all of a sudden 350,000 people showed up in a cow pasture in upstate New York, and it was for 3 days the third largest city in New York, and there were no cops, there were nothing. It was just, and it was completely kind of anti-materialist. And of course, Madison Avenue took note of that. And within a few years, they were using hippies to advertise Volkswagens and Pepsi and whatever, I mean, it all got co-opted pretty quickly. Yeah. And there, there's a great scene in the last scene of, the series about Mad Men, about Madison Avenue, where, on an acid trip, almost Don Draper decides to come up with the Coke ad,
It's a real thing, right?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I think that rock and roll lost its power because it kind of became just part of the culture. It wasn't unique in that sense. And we have to remember also that when Bob Dylan made his first album, it only sold 4,000 copies. And the point was that what was on the radio in 1962 and 63 was Frankie Avalon and Fabian, and I don't think anybody remembers anything they ever did. And yet there was this other thing, this underground thing, which Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Pete Seeger and all of that represented, that was speaking to both the political moment and the cultural moment. And of course, the opening scene in my book is at Newport Folk Festival in 1965, where Dylan decides to go electric.
Electric, right.
And the folkies and the protest singer people just freaked out completely. And completely, they booed him off the stage. Which was a shock to everybody.
Yeah, it's we all have some degree of attachment to our legacy thinking, even hip folk singers and protesters, I suppose. I guess it seems as though music has become more of a commodity. I mean, partly, I think, with the streaming services, you have this kind of just washed out dashboard of thousands and thousands of groups. Each one, I mean, I guess one kind of extreme version of that would be K-pop, where basically people are being groomed to fit a certain template. They're not, and they're products. They're engineered, and they're engineered to stimulate consumption of music as opposed to the love of music, because music is opening up your heart and your mind and your political point of view or whatever. And I mean, there are obviously, people in the music business who espouse principles, but I'm wondering where you see this all going. And, you obviously also have a very powerful set of insights into the new technology companies with their grip on us in terms of social media and, Amazon stimulation of consumption and everything like that. Where do you see popular culture going now? And do you feel like kids these days are lucky or deprived compared to the way we oldsters had it in the 60s?
Well, I only caught the last tale of your previous guests, but I have to say that I don't think that scarcity is the problem, especially in culture. Quite frankly, there's too much. You and I were probably lucky enough to grow up in an era where there were 3 networks, and if Walter Cronkite finished his newscasts every night to maybe 30 million people saying that's the way it is, June 5th, 1975, it was probably agreed by 80 to 90% of those people that that's the way it was. In other words, we had an agreed set of facts. And so in that sense, maybe having fewer voices, but voices that were trying to reach out to everybody was probably more useful. Today, of course, you can, start your day with conservative talk radio and then switch over to Alex Jones and then finish your evening with Sean Hannity, and you can have a completely different set of facts from what is real. You can live in an alternative universe. So in the cultural context, if you think about it, when you and I were working in the music business, everybody used to talk about the 80-20 rule, the Pareto curve, right? That a record company would make 80% of its revenue off of 20% of its output. And the same was true of the movie business when I first got in the movie business. 1 in 5 movies were hits. And that was just kind of an accepted thing. So when I wrote Move Fast and Break Things, I did a lot of research as to what was happening with, streaming. And it turned out that in the music business now, almost 90% of the streams come from 1% of the product. In other words, Jay-Z, Beyonce, Taylor Swift, Adele are doing great. But, the power curve, just like on YouTube or anything, just drops off a cliff. And you essentially, you get a gigantic number of people who are doing output that maybe their mother and their girlfriend and their best friend listen to, but that's probably about it. And so they can pretend they're in the music business, but it's just a pretend. It's like a hobby. And so, but the other problem is that the algorithms that determine, because you can't possibly yourself curate, understand what's new, what's good, what's everything. And so you essentially let Netflix, Amazon, Apple do all that work for you. And they don't have humans doing that. They have algorithms doing that. And so that, of course, just prioritizes the hit stuff even more. It's just like going on a search engine. Nobody goes past the first page of Google search engine. And then, of course, now today, when you go on Google search engine, the top 5 spots are all paid for. So, it's even more distorted.
Right.
And the same is true at Amazon. So much of Amazon's selling of books is all got to do with how much is a publisher willing to pay for promotion.
Yeah, it's the engineering of taste and the engineering of desire and the engineering of consumption. That statistic about 1% and 99% is really sobering, because it also means that it would seem anyway, that it's much harder to become a professional musician. And how can you make money if you're in the bottom 99%? The odds are against you.
So my son is a recording engineer and producer in Oakland. And there are a lot of indie bands in Oakland. And up till the beginning of the pandemic, they just assumed the only way they could make money was playing live in a little club. That they were never going to make any money off of streaming or, making records. And that's kind of a depressing thought, because here we are in a digital age where you and I have a device in our pocket that can stream any piece of music anywhere in the world to anyone. And yet it's not making any money for anybody but the very top group of people. So, the other problem to me is that there's a kind of flattening effect. So, think about the television universe. I talked about like a Rolling Stone or the times they are a changin', or Blowin' in the Wind, or We Shall Overcome. All those songs in the 60s were very aspirational. But when I think about what the cultural output is post 9/11, and just take, for example, television, all the hit dramas post 9/11, The Sopranos, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, Succession, all of them have one thing in common, which is that the hero is an amoral, horrible person in the middle of a corrupt world who either kills people or deals meth or is a soulless ad man who has no morals whatsoever and is lying about his past or chops people's heads off, or is in Succession is Rupert Murdoch, who will do anything to get ahead. And so if you're constantly putting it out that the world is corrupt and only the amoral criminal is the person who you're going to root for, who's the protagonist, I think that is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that worries me.
So why do you think that is? I mean, do you think that's back to the Roman notion of, spectacle and throwing people in the ring as gladiators to see who kills who first? I mean, is this kind of like bread and circuses time, or is there something else at work?
I think that's a good part of it. In my book, I note that there was another period that had this very dystopian, nihilistic point of view, and we called it film noir. And it was the very early 50s. Double Indemnity is the perfect example. So we're going to kill your husband, and we're going to make off with all the insurance money, his life insurance. And it's a perfect outcome, isn't it, honey? So the point being that, film noir, at least Norman Mailer thinks it came because it was a reaction to the dropping of the atomic bomb. I mean, that for artists, this was a dark and stormy time. And it could be that The Wire or Sopranos or anything that came after 9/11 was maybe some reaction to the kind of fear culture that was being, pounded into your head. I mean, it's hard for us to remember now how scared everybody was, or at least the government wanted you to be scared in, 2002. But perhaps that had some influence on the culture makers. I think there also is, as you pointed out, the bread and circuses aspect of it, which then brings us around to the question of social media. I've said publicly that if Facebook had existed in 1955, we'd still have polio, because the existence of the anti-vax movement is all based on Facebook. Some people at the Lancet have said that Facebook maybe made close to $1 billion off of ads associated with anti-vax stuff over the last 4 years. So,
Astonishing.
So, people would say, oh, it's Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, if he's lucky, has 1,500,000 people watch him a night.
Right.
But Facebook is reaching 250 million Americans every single day. And so until we figure out how to deal with disinformation, we're going to be facing this kind of same problem. And so the very fact that these social networks create havoc for musicians, as you well know, as you probably know, YouTube doesn't pay musicians. Anybody can put anything up for free on YouTube, and there's nothing I can do about it because they have a safe harbor liability exemption given to them by the government. And so until we deal with some of these issues, I don't think we're going to get it worked out very well.
Yeah, we're in I think a dicey period in the sense that we're beginning to emerge from a pandemic that was existential brush with death for everybody, right? We're either going to get sick or we're going to die, or we're going to know somebody who's
Right.
going to get sick or is going to die, and that creates an enormous amount of stress. I just wrote a piece called "Are You Ready for the Reemergence?" which posited that there were three big kind of social psychological archetypes coming out of the pandemic. And it relates to culture and media. You know, one is nostalgia. You know, give me that trip to Disneyland, or give me, you know, my kind of comforting experiences. And then the second is delusion, right? So societies under stress, anthropologists have known this for quite some time, will exhibit bizarre delusional symptoms like, you know, the Melanesians after World War II, building effigies of airplanes because they believed if they did that, the DC-3s that were loaded with ice cream and spam would come back.
Cargo
Right?
cults.
Cargo cults, right? And they would, I mean, the descriptions are amazing. You know, they would have coconut helmets, and they would, you know, parade along the perimeter, and they would, you know, make these mock landing strips. And, you know, we see almost a comparable level of delusion among some of our colleagues here, right here in our own country. So that's the second. And then the third, you know, is what I call the heroic response, which is really, okay, no maps, not going to go back, have to go forward, hero's journey, night sea journey, get going, find perspectives not like yours, and deal with the uncertainty, you know. And I think that, you know, the people who operate the popular culture machine, you know, as you said, there's a whole industry devoted to delusion right now, and it's not going away, which is why it's very difficult to get, you know, societal scale decision making done. And then, you know, you couldn't go wrong investing in nostalgia because it pays. Right. And the question is whether, you know, there's going to be support for a more, you know, proactive, prospective, heroic, future oriented stance as well, because that's ultimately what we need.
Yeah, I quite frankly feel somewhat optimistic. I mean, I understand. I think your analysis is very right on. I think that nostalgia will be a very saleable element, and I can see already in the music business a great desire. I mean, I believe that James Taylor and Jackson Browne are going to go out on the road this summer, and they'll probably sell out every single stadium they play
Sure.
at.
Yeah.
As for delusion, it does seem astonishing to me that you have a whole political party dedicated to delusion. And, you know, I don't know how long they can sustain that, but, you know, as long as social media is there, you can keep it going. As far as the heroic response is, I think that the real heroic response is the willingness of people to take chances. And if you look at the history of pandemics, the Black Death wiped out more than half the citizens of Florence. And 25 years later, the greatest flowering of creativity in the art world, the Renaissance, started, right? And here they were all, you talk to, you know, read Jacques Barzun, you know, that notion that all these creative people close to each other creating, and people said maybe the Decameron, which was written during the Black Death, was the first Renaissance document, right? And certainly in 1918, here we had another close to a plague. I mean, the horrible flu killed millions of people. And the 20s, I would argue, were some of the most vital creative times in America. Certainly the invention of the movies, you know, Charlie Chaplin and all of that. Certainly Louis Armstrong's work in the jazz world, and certainly Hemingway and Fitzgerald in writing were some of the greatest people that we all still can listen to today and say, that is fucking great, you know? And so, you know, sometimes Aaron Donde Roy says that that a pandemic is like a pause button, and it makes you rethink everything. And hopefully people like yourself will come kind of lead us out of the jungle. But my argument in my book is that the artists have to be in the forefront of that, because, Marcuse says the role of the artist is to show you what can be, not what is or what was, but what can be. And I don't see a lot of kind of envision of the future that isn't incredibly dystopian. I mean, the world does not have to be Blade Runner,
or 1984. Yeah,
Right.
I think that it'll depend on whether there are platforms that are alternatives to the big commercial platforms that are empowering and kind of democratizing of people's access. And there are a lot of experiments going on in that regard to try to bring the 99% into more alignment with where things need to go. I read One Dimensional Man too in college, and the whole idea that the artist is an antenna for society, and that it's very easy to co-opt that kind of intelligence in a sense is very sobering. So I think people like your good self, who are in a way stewards of and have the perspective on how culture has evolved and how vulnerable it can be to the amplifying effects of social media, but also to the crowding out of economic activity. If you've got Amazon, why do you need all this other stuff? If you've got Spotify, why do you need all this other stuff? And putting an economic model back into culture at its vital green roots, that's, I think, probably one of the most important things that needs to happen. I mean, we'll all be looking for the seeds of the new roaring 20s, the Renaissance that we may be going through. Exciting times.
Just one scary thought, though. I was invited up to Google after Move Fast and Break Things came out, and they had a small seminar-like conference on AI and the movies. And they basically had some engineers who made the argument that AI could write a better screenplay than any human author. In other words, that they were going to feed every single Marvel screenplay into the AI, and then they would rate how well those movies did, and somehow out of this, the AI would create the perfect Marvel movie, out of this. And I said to them, I don't understand why you want to do this. The problem in the movie is this lack of originality. And all you're doing is creating a machine that can mimic what's already been done. I mean, if you look at the movies that changed my life, and especially the output of Hollywood in the early 70s when I was there, whether it's American Graffiti or Mean Streets or Badlands or Easy Rider or Five Easy Pieces or The Godfather, or all those movies that came out at that time, every one of them was an original. They weren't a sequel of anything. They were absolutely fresh and new, and that's what made people excited about them.
Well, I think they want to do it because they can do it, and also because the technology has gotten so sophisticated that you literally could pour every screenplay and every director's version of a shooting script into an AI and come out with the answer to the question, how do you make money? Which I think, but within a bounded universe of, it's a good thing to get 20 more Marvel MCU movies out, because it'll make a lot of people happy. It won't advance the culture necessarily. And the problem with what you're saying is that we're all going to be looking in this big mirror and seeing essentially the reflection of our desires instead of piercing through the mirror, going through the wonder wall, as George Harrison might have put it, to see something really breathtaking.
Right.
So, Jonathan, we're not worthy. We're so happy that we could have you on the show. As I said at the beginning, I've been a big fan of yours. Actually, I think we probably didn't cross paths with Richard Rainwater and the whole Disney thing, but I was an advisor to Bass Brothers too, and I heard your name bandied about a lot. So we've had the music, the movies, and the kind of highfalutin finance connections, but we're finally meeting in 2021. So what a pleasure.
Well, let's hopefully do it in real life too, as well as virtually.
Well,
thank you so much.
All right.
It was a fascinating conversation.
Great to see you, and thank you again. Thank you again. Okay, well, wow, that's 3 bags full. Lots to ponder there. Just please know that we are starting to post summaries of the podcasts. We're doing our best to update ourselves with regard to our proposed newsletter, and there will be other embodiments of intersections to come. So as always, it's a work in progress. We're so fortunate to have great guests. And Gregarious, why don't you take us home?